There are more than 1 million wooden logs buried beneath New York City. Some of them are 100 feet underground. They've been there for over 200 years, and they're the only reason half the buildings in Manhattan are still standing. These aren't decorative timbers, they're foundation piles. Logs driven deep into the ground to create stable foundations in soil that couldn't support a building on its own. Every major structure built in New York before 1900 sits on top of wooden pilings. Trinity Church, City Hall, the Brooklyn Bridge, all of them rest on forests of logs that were buried before anyone alive today was born. The logs are still there, still doing their job, still holding up millions of tons of brick and stone and steel. And the men who drove those piles into the ground did it with nothing but sledgehammers, pile drivers, and muscle. So why was New York built on top of wooden logs? How did workers drive 100-foot piles into bedrock? And what happens when those logs start to rot? In 1626, when the Dutch founded New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan, they had a problem. The land they wanted to build on wasn't actually land. It was a tidal marsh, soft mud that flooded twice a day with the tides. You couldn't build on it. A foundation laid directly on that mud would sink within a year. The Dutch knew how to solve this. They'd been building on soft ground for centuries. Amsterdam itself was built on pilings. The entire city rested on wooden posts driven through peat and clay down to stable sand layers. They brought that same technology to New Amsterdam. The method was simple. You cut logs, usually pine or oak, to the length you needed. You sharpened one end to a point. Then you drove them into the ground until they hit something solid. That might be bedrock. That might be a layer of compact clay. That might be hardpan, a natural cement of clay and gravel that formed over thousands of years. Once the piling was driven to refusal, that's the term they used when the pile wouldn't go any deeper, you cut it off at the desired elevation. Then you drove another pile next to it, and another, until you had a forest of pilings spaced a few feet apart. Then you laid a timber cap across the tops of all the piles, creating a platform. That's what you built your foundation on. The pilings didn't support the building by compression. They weren't strong enough for that. A wooden log, even a big one, will crush under the weight of a 5-story building. The pilings work by friction. The weight of the building pushed down on the pilings, and the friction between the wood and the surrounding soil held them in place. The soil gripped the pilings from all sides, preventing them from sinking further. But here's the critical part. The pilings had to stay wet, continuously wet, never exposed to air. Wood exposed to air and moisture rots. Fungi and bacteria consume it. A log left on the forest floor will decompose completely in 10 years. But wood that's buried underground, below the water table, where there's no oxygen, doesn't rot. It can last for centuries. The pilings under Amsterdam have been there since the 1600s. Some of them are over 400 years old and still structurally sound. New York's pilings work the same way. As long as they stay below the water table, below the point where groundwater saturates the soil, they're preserved. The anaerobic conditions prevent decay. The wood essentially becomes a stable foundation material that will last as long as it stays buried. The problem is when the water table drops, when construction nearby lowers the groundwater level, when a building pumps out its basement and accidentally drains the surrounding soil.
When that happens, the tops of the pilings are exposed to air. And once they're exposed, they start to rot. But we're getting ahead of the story. First, someone had to drive those pilings into the ground. And in the 1700s and 1800s, that meant pile drivers. A pile driver is a simple machine. You have a weight, usually an iron mass shaped like a cylinder or pyramid. You have a frame, a wooden or iron structure that guides the weight as it falls. You have ropes or chains to lift the weight. And you have the pile itself, the log you're trying to drive into the ground. The weight sits on top of the pile. Workers pull the ropes, lifting the weight up the frame. When it reaches the top, anywhere from 10 to 30 feet high, depending on the machine, they release it.
The weight falls. It hits the top of the pile. The impact drives the pile a few inches deeper into the ground. Then they do it again. Lift, release, impact, lift, release, impact. A pile that needed to go 40 feet deep might require 500 blows, A pile that needed to go 80 feet might require 2,000 blows. The workers counted every one. The pile-driving crews were small, 6 to 10 men, 2 or 3 on the ropes lifting the weight, 1 man guiding the pile, making sure it stayed vertical, 1 man watching the progress, measuring how much the pile advanced with each blow, and a foreman who decided when the pile had reached refusal. The work was brutal. You're pulling a 300-pound weight 30 feet into the air using nothing but rope and muscle.
You're doing this 50 times an hour for 10 hours a day. Your hands blister, then callus, then blister again through the calluses. Your shoulders burn, your back locks up. The noise was constant. The iron weight hitting the top of the pile created a sharp crack that echoed off every building in the area. If you were driving piles in a developed neighborhood, residents complained about the noise. The pile-driving crews started at dawn and worked until sunset, 6 days a week. The sound never stopped. The danger came from the ropes. If a rope broke while the weight was being lifted, the weight fell. If you were standing in the wrong place, it would kill you. If the rope broke at the top of the lift, the weight fell from 30 feet. That much iron moving that fast didn't just crush,
it obliterated. In July of 1789, a pile-driving crew was working on what would become Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan. They were driving foundation piles for a warehouse that was being built near the waterfront. A worker named Samuel Reed was guiding a pile when the lifting rope snapped. The 300-pound weight fell from 25 feet and hit him across the back. He died instantly. The pile-driving crew finished the job that afternoon. They needed the work. The company paid Reed's widow $15. That was standard compensation. No pension, no ongoing support. $15 for a dead husband. As New York grew, the need for pilings grew with it. By 1800, the city was expanding rapidly. Buildings were getting taller, heavier, more substantial. The soft soil near the waterfront couldn't support them without pilings. But the city was also expanding onto land that had been underwater. The entire southern tip of Manhattan is built on landfill. The shoreline in 1600 was several blocks inland from where it is today. Creating that landfill required more pilings. You'd drive a line of pilings out into the water, creating a wall. Then you'd fill in behind the wall with rocks, dirt, construction debris, whatever you could find. Once the fill settled, you'd drive another line of pilings further out and fill in behind that. Manhattan literally grew by pushing the water line further into the harbor. The South Street Seaport area was built this way. So was Battery Park.
So was much of the financial district. Under all of that land are thousands upon thousands of pilings driven into the harbor floor, creating a stable foundation for the fill. The Trinity Church, built in 1798 at the corner of Broadway and Wall Street, sits on 114 pilings. Each piling is approximately 40 feet long, driven through fill and soft clay down to a layer of compact sand. The church weighs roughly 6,000 tons. Those 114 pilings, plus the friction of the surrounding soil, have been holding it up for 226 years. City Hall, completed in 1812, sits on 230 pilings. Each one is between 35 and 50 feet long, depending on where it was driven. The soil depth varied across the building site. Some pilings hit bedrock at 35 feet. Others went to 50 before reaching refusal. The Brooklyn Bridge, started in 1869, required a different approach. The bridge towers needed to rest on solid bedrock because the weight was too great for pilings. But getting down to bedrock under the East River required caissons, massive wooden boxes that workers excavated from the inside while compressed air kept the water out. That's a different story, one we've covered before. But the approaches to the bridge, the ramps and support structures on both sides, those sit on pilings, thousands of them. Every one of those pilings was driven by hand.
Men with pile drivers, working in teams, driving logs into the ground 6 inches at a time. The scale is hard to comprehend. Trinity Church alone required 114 logs, each 40 feet long. That's over 4,500 linear feet of timber. A single building. Now multiply that by every major structure in Manhattan built before 1900. Every church, every government building, every warehouse, every apartment block in the soft soil areas. The number of pilings runs into the hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million. Where did all those logs come from? The forests. In the 17 and 1800s, New York State was covered in virgin timber, white pine, oak, chestnut, hemlock, trees that had been growing for 200 years. The Hudson Valley had logging operations that supplied New York City with construction timber. Logs would be cut upstate, floated down the Hudson River in massive rafts, then sorted and distributed to construction sites. The logs used for pilings were selected for straightness and lack of defects. You needed logs that were relatively uniform in diameter. A log that tapered too much would be hard to drive because the resistance increased as the pile went deeper. You needed logs without major knots or rot. A weak spot in a piling meant it could break under the stress of being driven. The best pilings were cut from old-growth trees. The wood was denser, stronger, more resistant to compression.
A piling cut from a 200-year-old white pine would outlast a piling cut from a 50-year-old tree. The old-growth timber was more expensive, but it lasted longer. By the mid-1800s, the virgin forests near New York were mostly gone. Cut for lumber, cleared for farmland, harvested for charcoal to feed the city's growing industrial operations. Logging moved further north and west. The logs still came down the Hudson, but now they were coming from the Adirondacks instead of the Hudson Valley. The men who drove the pilings were professionals. Pile driving was a skilled trade. A good pile driving crew could drive 20 piles in a day, assuming the soil cooperated. A bad crew might only drive 10. The difference came down to experience.
An experienced crew knew how to position the pile driver. They knew how to judge the soil conditions. They knew when a pile was approaching refusal versus when it had hit a rock that could be driven through. They knew how to adjust the weight of the driver based on the pile's depth. A pile that was already 40 feet deep needed a heavier weight to drive it further than a pile that was only 10 feet deep. The foreman was the key. He decided everything: how deep each pile needed to go, what spacing to use, when to stop driving. If the foreman misjudged, the building would settle unevenly. One corner would sink faster than the others. Cracks would appear in the walls. Doors wouldn't close. Eventually, if the settlement was severe enough, the building would have to be demolished. There was a pile-driving foreman in New York in the 1840s named Patrick Brennan. He'd learned the trade from his father, who'd learned it from his father. 3 generations of pile drivers. Brennan could look at a building site and tell you exactly how many piles you needed, how deep they had to go, and what spacing to use. He did it by eye, based on decades of experience. The builders trusted him absolutely. If Brennan said you needed 50 piles at 40 feet, you drove 50 piles at 40 feet. If he said the soil was too soft and you needed to go deeper, you went deeper. He understood soil mechanics before anyone had formalized the science of geotechnical engineering. Brennan worked on buildings all over Lower Manhattan.
He died in 1863 at the age of 67 from what the doctors called lung fever, probably pneumonia. He'd spent 50 years driving piles in all weather: winter, summer, rain, snow. The exposure finally caught up with him. The knowledge he'd accumulated about New York's subsurface conditions died with him. It was never written down. His crew at the time of his death included his nephew, Michael Brennan, who'd been learning the trade for 15 years. Michael tried to continue the business, but he didn't have Patrick's gift for reading soil. Within 2 years, he'd taken a job with a larger pile-driving company. The Brennan name disappeared from New York's construction records. But the buildings Patrick Brennan's crews worked on are still standing. There's a warehouse on Front Street that his crew pile-drived in 1846. It's now luxury condos, but the foundation is original. 62 pilings, each 43 feet deep, spaced at 8-foot intervals. Brennan's specifications, executed by his crew, still holding up the building 178 years later. But the bigger question is what happens to those pilings today? They've been underground for 100, 200, in some cases 250 years. Are they still doing their job? The short answer is yes. As long as they stay below the water table, they're fine. The wood is essentially pickled. The anaerobic conditions preserve it indefinitely.
Archaeologists have found wooden pilings in Europe that are over 1,000 years old and still structurally sound. But the water table in Manhattan isn't stable. It fluctuates based on rainfall, based on how much water gets pumped out of basements, based on construction activity that redirects groundwater flow. When the water table drops, the tops of pilings get exposed to air. Once exposed, they rot. Fast. A piling that's been perfectly preserved for 200 years can rot through in 5 years once it's exposed. The fungi and bacteria that couldn't survive in anaerobic conditions thrive when oxygen is present. They consume the wood fiber. The piling weakens. And if enough pilings under a building weaken, the building settles. This has happened multiple times.
In 1897, a building on Water Street in Lower Manhattan developed a severe lean. The southeast corner had settled 6 inches lower than the northwest corner. An inspection revealed that the foundation pilings had rotted. The building had been constructed in 1823 on 40-foot pilings driven down to compact sand. For 70 years, the pilings were fine. Then, in 1895, a building was constructed next door. The new building had a deep basement. To keep the basement dry, they installed pumps that ran continuously, removing groundwater. Those pumps lowered the water table in the surrounding area by 12 feet. The tops of the pilings under the 1823 building were now exposed to air. Within 2 years, they'd rotted through.
The building settled. It had to be demolished. The inspection report, preserved in the New York City archives, describes the condition of the pilings when they were excavated. The wood below the waterline was sound, hard, dense, almost petrified from centuries of submersion. The wood above the waterline had turned to punky mush. You could push your finger through it. The structural integrity was completely gone. The pilings hadn't failed uniformly. The ones on the side closest to the new building's pumps had rotted worst. The ones further away were still partially intact. This created the differential settlement. One part of the building sank faster than the other, causing the lean. The owners of the 1823 building sued the owners of the new building.
They argued that the pumping had destroyed their foundation. The case went to court. It took 3 years to resolve. The judge ruled in favor of the 1823 building. The new building's owners had to pay damages of $32,000 and install a system to recharge the groundwater in the area. But the old building was still gone. Once pilings rot, there's no fixing them. You can't replace a foundation piling without lifting the entire building off its foundation. And lifting a 5-story brick building isn't something you could do in 1897. You still can't do it easily today. Modern buildings in New York mostly don't use wooden pilings anymore. They use steel H-beams driven to bedrock. They use concrete caissons. They use deep foundation systems that go down 100, 200, sometimes 300 feet to solid rock. These foundations are permanent. They don't care about the water table. But all those old buildings, the ones built before 1900, they're still sitting on wooden pilings. And those pilings are still there, buried under the streets, under the sidewalks, under the basements. You can't see them. Most people don't know they're there. But they're holding up some of the most important structures in the city. The challenge for modern engineers is monitoring these old foundations. When a building with wooden pilings undergoes renovation, or when construction happens nearby, engineers have to assess whether the pilings are still sound.
This usually involves drilling test borings near the building to check the water table level and taking samples of the soil to see if conditions have changed. If the water table has dropped, emergency measures have to be taken. Sometimes this means installing groundwater recharge systems, essentially pumping water back into the ground to raise the water table. Sometimes it means underpinning the building, adding new foundation elements that bypass the old pilings entirely. Both approaches are expensive and complicated. The New York City Department of Buildings maintains a registry of historic structures known to have wooden pile foundations. This registry helps contractors avoid accidentally compromising these foundations during nearby construction. But the registry is incomplete. Many buildings built in the 1800s have no surviving foundation records. Nobody knows for certain whether they have pilings or not until excavation work begins. Trinity Church still sits on those 114 pilings from 1798. The church has been renovated multiple times. The interior has been completely rebuilt. But the foundation hasn't changed. Those same 40-foot logs are still there, still doing their job. City Hall still sits on 230 pilings from 1812. The building has been expanded, modified, updated with modern systems, but the foundation is original. Those pilings have been underground for 212 years. There's a building on Pearl Street, constructed in 1831, that sits on pilings driven by Patrick Brennan's crew. The building is now a restaurant. The current owners have no idea that their foundation rests on 60 wooden logs that are 45 feet underground. But those logs are there, and they're still working. The knowledge of how to properly install and maintain these foundations has mostly been lost. When Patrick Brennan died in 1863, his understanding of New York's soil conditions died with him. There were other pile-driving foremen, but none with his level of experience. And as the technology changed, as steel and concrete replaced wood, the old knowledge became irrelevant.
Today, if you need to drive pilings in New York, you use hydraulic pile drivers that can drive a steel H-beam 100 feet in an hour. You don't need a crew of men pulling ropes. You don't need a foreman who can read soil conditions by eye. You have soil reports. You have geotechnical engineers. You have equipment that does the work of 50 men. But you've lost the connection between the worker and the ground. The old pile drivers knew soil in a way we don't anymore. They could feel when a pile hit bedrock versus when it hit a boulder. They could tell you if the soil was going to settle or if it was stable. They knew this because they'd driven thousands of pilings. They'd watched how buildings performed on different foundations. They'd seen what worked and what didn't. That experiential knowledge is gone. We have better technology now, we have better materials, but we've lost something when we stopped needing to understand the ground at that level of detail. There's a strange intimacy to driving a wooden pile into the ground. You're taking a tree that grew for 100 years, cutting it down, sharpening one end, and burying it underground where it will stay for centuries. You're connecting the forest to the city, the natural world to the built environment. The living wood becomes part of the urban infrastructure. And the men who did this work, the pile-driving crews who spent their lives driving logs into the ground, they understood that connection. They weren't just installing foundations. They were building the city on top of a buried forest.
The numbers are staggering when you add them up. Trinity Church alone used 114 logs. City Hall used 230. A typical warehouse in the 1800s used between 20 and 60 pilings, depending on the size. A large apartment building used 100 or more. Estimate conservatively. Say there were 1,000 major buildings in Manhattan built on pilings before 1900. And that's probably a low estimate, but let's use it. Average 50 pilings per building. That's 50,000 pilings. 50,000 logs, each 30 to 60 feet long. That's 1.5 million to 3 million linear feet of timber, buried underground, still there. But that's just the major buildings. What about the smaller structures? The row houses, the shops? The small warehouses, add those in, and you're probably looking at several 100,000 more pilings. The total number could easily exceed 250,000 individual logs. Consider the waterfront areas specifically. Every wharf, every pier, every dock structure built before 1900 sits on pilings. The South Street Seaport had over 50 commercial buildings, each requiring foundations. The wharves themselves, extending out into the East River, were massive timber structures built on thousands of pilings driven into the river bottom. A single wharf might require 500 pilings to create a stable platform that could support the weight of cargo, workers, horses, and wagons. There were dozens of wharves along the Manhattan waterfront, and the West Side piers, the East River docks, the tip of Manhattan where the rivers met. All of it built on wooden pilings. The Fulton Fish Market, which operated from 1822 until 2005, sat on pilings driven in the 1820s. When the market finally closed and the building was renovated, an inspection revealed that many of the original pilings were still sound. 183 years underground, still structurally viable. The old Customs House at the southern tip of Manhattan, built in 1907, sits on pilings despite being constructed in the 20th century. The site required foundations that went down 90 feet to reach bedrock. The first 40 feet used steel H-beams, but the lower 50 feet used timber pilings because they were cheaper and just as effective in the anaerobic mud at that depth. That building alone used over 300 pilings, 300 logs, each 50 feet long, 15,000 linear feet of timber for one building constructed after wooden pilings were supposedly obsolete. 250,000 trees, cut from the forests of New York State, floated down the Hudson River, driven into the ground beneath Manhattan, still holding up the city 200 years later. And the men who drove those piles? Most of their names are lost. We have Patrick Brennan, because he was famous in his time. We have Samuel Reed, because his death was recorded in a newspaper.
But the thousands of other pile drivers who worked in New York over 2 centuries? They're anonymous. The pile driving crews were often Irish immigrants, men who'd come to America fleeing the famine in Ireland. They took dangerous jobs because they needed the money. Pile driving paid better than dock work or factory work. $3 a day for a pile driver versus $2 for a laborer. That extra dollar made the difference between sending money home to family in Ireland or not. These men worked in all weather. Winter was the worst. When the ground froze, driving piles became exponentially harder. The frozen soil resisted the piles. You'd hit a pile 50 times and it would advance an inch. Your hands would go numb from the cold. The ropes would become stiff and hard to grip. Summer brought its own problems. The heat in New York in July and August was oppressive. You're pulling 300 pounds of iron weight 30 feet into the air, doing it 50 times an hour. The sweat pours off you. Your clothes are soaked through in 20 minutes. Heat exhaustion was common. Men would collapse mid-shift and have to be carried off the site. Spring and fall were the best working seasons. Moderate temperatures, ground that wasn't frozen but wasn't muddy. These were the months when pile driving crews could make real progress. A good crew in good weather could drive 30 piles in a day. That was exceptional, but it was possible. The pile drivers developed their own techniques. Some crews sang while they worked. Not songs with words, usually.
Just rhythmic chanting that helped synchronize the rope pulling. Lift on the beat, release on the beat, impact on the beat. The rhythm kept everyone coordinated. Some crews used call and response. The foreman would call out heave, and the rope pullers would lift together. He'd call hold at the top of the lift to make sure everyone was ready, then loose to release the weight. The vocabulary of pile driving became its own specialized language. Other crews worked in silence, relying on visual cues. The foreman would raise his hand for the lift, hold it at the top, then drop it for the release. This method worked better in crowded work sites where multiple pile drivers were operating simultaneously. You couldn't hear your own foreman's voice over the noise of 3 other crews.
The noise was one of the hardest parts of the job. That sharp crack when the weight hit the pile would echo off every surface. In a dense neighborhood with brick buildings on all sides, the sound would bounce and amplify. Workers who spent years on pile driving crews often developed significant hearing loss by the time they were 40. Some went completely deaf. The physical toll extended beyond hearing. The repetitive motion of pulling ropes created chronic shoulder problems. Rotator cuff tears were common. Men would work through the pain because they couldn't afford to stop. No work meant no pay. No pay meant your family didn't eat. Hernias were another occupational hazard. The strain of lifting heavy weights dozens of times per hour, every day, put enormous pressure on the abdominal wall. Once a hernia developed, it would only get worse with continued work. But surgery was expensive, and recovery took months. Most pile drivers worked with untreated hernias until the pain became unbearable. Back injuries were nearly universal. By the time a pile driver reached 50, if he reached 50, his spine was compressed and arthritic. Standing up straight became difficult. Bending over was agony. Many former pile drivers spent their final years hunched and crippled, unable to work, subsisting on whatever their families could provide. There was no workers' compensation in the 1800s, no disability insurance, no retirement benefits.
When you couldn't work anymore, you were on your own. Some men ended up in poorhouses, the charitable institutions that house the destitute. Others relied on family. A few managed to save enough to survive, but they were the exceptions. The tools were simple but heavy. The pile driver frame was usually made of timber, massive oak beams mortised and T-known together. The frame had to be stable. If it shifted while the weight was falling, the weight could miss the pile and crash into the frame itself. That's how frames got destroyed and workers got killed. The weight itself was either iron or lead. Lead was better because it was denser. You could get more mass in a smaller package. But lead was expensive. Most pile drivers used iron weights. These were cast in foundries specifically for pile driving. They weighed between 200 and 500 pounds, depending on the depth you needed to drive. The ropes were hemp, usually. Manila hemp from the Philippines was the best, but it was also the most expensive. Domestic hemp worked, but wore out faster. The ropes took incredible abuse. The constant lifting and releasing frayed them. Pile driving crews inspected their ropes daily. A rope that was starting to fray would be replaced immediately. Nobody wanted to be there when a rope snapped. The pilings themselves were prepared with care. The sharpened end, the point that would penetrate the ground first, had to be shaped correctly. Too blunt, and the pile wouldn't penetrate. Too sharp, and the point would break off when it hit a rock. The ideal point was a gradual taper over the last 18 inches of the log. Some pilings were fitted with iron shoes. These were metal caps that protected the point as it was driven through rocky soil. The shoe would take the abuse instead of the wood. A piling with a good iron shoe could be driven through ground that would destroy a plain wooden pile. The other end of the piling, the end that received the blows from the weight, was also critical. Every impact created compression forces in the wood. Over hundreds of blows, the end would start to mushroom, the wood fibers crushing and spreading outward. This is called brooming.
Once a piling broomed, it became harder to drive because the enlarged end created more friction with the surrounding soil. To prevent brooming, pile drivers used an iron ring around the top of the pile. The ring contained the wood, preventing it from spreading. A well-maintained pile could be driven hundreds of times without significant brooming. A pile without a ring might broom after 50 blows. These details mattered. The difference between a piling that went down clean and one that broomed or broke or refused to drive could be the difference between a building that stood for 200 years and one that settled and cracked within a decade. And all of this knowledge lived in the hands and eyes and experience of the pile-driving crews.
They learned it from the generation before them. They passed it on to the apprentices they trained. When the technology changed and wooden pilings were replaced by steel, that knowledge became obsolete. There was no reason to preserve it, no reason to write it down. Today, if you walk down Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan, you're walking on top of pilings driven in the 1820s. If you visit Trinity Church, you're standing above logs from 1798. If you go to City Hall, the floor under your feet is supported by 230 wooden piles driven in 1812. You can't see them. There's no marker. There's no memorial. Most people have no idea they're there, but they are, buried in the anaerobic mud beneath the city, preserved by the absence of oxygen, still doing the job they were driven to do 200 years ago, still holding up buildings that collectively weigh millions of tons. And somewhere in that buried forest of pilings are the ghosts of the men who drove them. Samuel Reed, killed in 1789 when a rope broke. Patrick Brennan, who drove piles for 50 years and knew New York soil better than anyone. The thousands of Irish immigrants whose names were never recorded. The pile-driving crews who spent their lives pulling ropes and driving logs into the ground. They built the foundation of New York City. Literally, every major structure built before 1900 rests on their work. The city grew upward from the pilings they drove. The skyscrapers that came later were possible because those early pilings stabilized the soft ground, allowing buildings to get progressively taller and heavier. The relationship between New York and its buried forest is something most people never think about. The city seems permanent, solid, built on rock, and parts of it are. Midtown Manhattan sits on bedrock close to the surface. You don't need pilings there. But Lower Manhattan, where the city started, where the oldest buildings are, that's all built on soft soil and fill. Without pilings, none of it would be standing. Trinity Church would have collapsed by 1810. City Hall would have settled and cracked by 1820. The entire financial district would have been uninhabitable. The pilings made it possible. And the men who drove them made the pilings possible. They took the raw material, the logs from upstate forests, and transformed them into urban infrastructure. They connected the natural world to the built environment in a way that's now invisible but still essential. Was it worth it? The city that grew from that work? The economic engine that New York became? The millions of people who lived and worked in buildings supported by those pilings? That's not a question I can answer. But I can tell you that the cost was paid in the backs and hands and lives of men who pulled ropes for 10 hours a day, men who worked in winter cold and summer heat, men who died when ropes broke or when pile drivers collapsed. Samuel Reed was 34 when the weight crushed him. When the ice sovereign, he left behind a wife and 2 children. The company paid his widow $15. That was the value they placed on his life. How many more Samuel Reeds were there? How many pile drivers died in accidents that weren't recorded in newspapers? How many were crippled by the work, their backs destroyed, their hands mangled, unable to work but receiving no compensation? We don't know. The records don't exist. The only evidence is the pilings themselves. Still there, still working. The physical legacy of men whose names are forgotten. When you walk through Lower Manhattan today, remember that you're walking on top of a forest, a buried forest of 250,000 logs driven into the ground by hand 200 years ago. Those logs are still there, still holding up the city, still doing their job, and the men who drove them, they deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as anonymous laborers, but as the craftsmen who built the foundation of New York City, who knew soil and wood and pilings in a way we've forgotten, who did impossible work with simple tools and muscle. Patrick Brennan, Samuel Reed, the thousands of others whose names are lost. They're down there too, not physically, but their work is. Every piling is a testament to their skill. Every building that still stands is proof that they knew what they were doing. The forest beneath the city, the buried logs, the hidden infrastructure that makes everything else possible. That's what they built, and it's still there.
If you want to understand how they harvested those logs upstate and floated them down the Hudson, that's in the next video about New York's timber trade. That's where this story begins. And if you made it this far, subscribe. I cover American urban history every week. The hidden infrastructure, the forgotten workers, the stories under the city. I'll see you in the next one.